Today we're going to be exploring Rosicrucianism and Stoicism. And I've presented on this topic before, including at the AMORC World Convention in Rome. However, there I was presenting to thousands of members, and it's difficult to have a discussion on these topics when there are so many people. So I want to take advantage of our coming together today so that we can actually discuss some of the things related to Rosicrucianism and Stoicism. My introduction to Stoicism came through a concurrence in a Rosicrucian monograph. In each monograph, at the beginning, we have an excerpt from a text that concurs with what's written in the monograph. And the one that I read was by Marcus Aurelius, and here is the concurrence. You need to avoid certain things in your train of thought. Everything random, everything irrelevant, and certainly everything self-important or malicious. You need to get used to winnowing your thoughts so that if someone says, "What are you thinking about?" you can respond at once and truthfully that you are thinking this or thinking that. This made a huge impression on me. And often after I read that concurrence, I would pause and think, what am I thinking about right now? So I encourage you to think for a moment, what are you thinking about? We're not going to share at this point, just focus. Is there anything random or irrelevant in your mind, or self-important, or malicious? So what is Stoicism? This can be summarized in 5 words. I don't mind what happens. That is a summary of Stoicism. I don't mind what happens. The goal of Stoicism is to have fewer negative emotions, to spend less time wishing things were different and more time enjoying them. So the goal of Stoicism is not to get rid of all thoughts, it's to have fewer negative thoughts. And the Stoic philosophers shared with us that happiness comes when we don't desire what we do not need, and when we want what we have. That is a surefire formula for happiness, when we want what we have. So I invite you now to think about what you may have in your life right now that is taking up space that you do not need. Are there any desires that you do not need that are taking up space for you? And just make a mental note of that. Stoicism began in the year 300 BCE. A man named Zeno was a very wealthy merchant in Citium, which is Cyprus. And he had all of his wealth on a ship, and the ship went down in the sea. And there was no insurance. So he went from being a very wealthy merchant to being destitute in Athens. And he met a bookseller in Athens and told him about his experience. And the bookseller advised him to seek out some of the philosophers who were in Athens. And he met a cynic. You know, cynic is a philosophy. Cynicism is a philosophy. And he met a cynic named Crates. And Crates helped Zeno come to terms with the fact that he was no longer the wealthy merchant who he was, and how he could move forward in his life. And Zeno then developed Stoicism. Here are a few quotations from Zeno. He said, "Happiness is a good flow of life. He also said, now that I have suffered a shipwreck, I am on a good journey. Now that I have suffered a shipwreck, I am on a good journey. And then he spoke to the goddess Fortuna. He said, you've done well, Fortuna, driving me thus to philosophy. So again, Zeno ended up in Athens after his shipwreck, was introduced to philosophers, and then he developed this philosophy that we call Stoicism today. And the Romans adopted this philosophy hundreds of years later. Sulla, who was a cruel Roman general, was indirectly responsible for the spread of Stoicism to Rome. He laid siege to Athens and burned it in the year 87 BCE. And many of the philosophers who were in Athens, then in a diaspora, went to other places, mostly to Alexandria and Rhodes and to Rome. And we know quite a bit about the ancient philosophy of Stoicism because of some writings that still exist. And one of those authors was Seneca, who was born in 4 BCE, and he went through transition in 65 of our era. And Seneca was a Roman dramatist and statesperson, and he was the tutor to the Roman Emperor Nero, and then he became his advisor. Seneca was from a wealthy and influential family, and he wrote, "Fight your ego, beware of flattery." Some Roman generals participated in what is called memento homo. And this is when a general came back after a huge triumph. A Roman general would parade through the streets on his chariot. And some of them participated in memento homo by having someone right there whispering to them, "Remember, you are only a man. Remember, you are only a man." So I invite you now to consider something, an experience in your life, a glorious moment when, if you were ever going to be a little bit proud of something, it was that moment. Think of yourself, you were really proud of yourself. You did something that was just spectacular. And imagine that someone who is on your side is next to you whispering in your ear, "Remember, you are only a man. Remember, you are only a woman." Now, Seneca also wrote in a way that was very easy for people to relate to. And he wrote in the third person. So when he wrote about himself, he wrote about Seneca, as though Seneca were another person. And he wrote one time that he was at a banquet and he was not assigned a good seat at the banquet. And while he was there, some of the other people made fun of him. They were making jokes, and they were making jokes at his expense, and he didn't think they were funny. And he became very upset about this. So after this, he examined what had happened, and he wrote about it in the third person. He said that Seneca was at a banquet, and the people there did not assign him to a prestigious seat, and others there made fun of him, and he didn't just brush it off. So first, he just observed what happened at this event, and then he assessed what happened. And his assessment was, Seneca should stay away from low company. Seneca should stay away from low company. That was the way that he was able to move on from being so upset and then upset at himself about being upset. So I invite you now to consider something challenging that has happened in your life and review it as dispassionately as possible and from a third person perspective. So think about something that happened in your life that you wish it had occurred differently. And observe it as though you are looking at someone else, at the third person, as if you were describing Seneca, describing himself at his own banquet. So first, just describe what happened to yourself. And now assess the situation, again, from the perspective of the third person. So you've observed what happened, and just like Seneca said, Seneca should stay away from low company. What conclusion could you come to when observing yourself in the third person? So consider that now. Assess the situation from the perspective of the third person. All right, so now we're going to unmute the microphones, and also please share in the chat. What benefit does this third person perspective provide? We're not asking for what your particular situation was or your assessment of it, but what benefit is there from the third person perspective?
Hello, Grandmaster Julie.
Hello.
Hey, everyone. Hello. I find that when I'm able to do that in a tough situation, that I can leave out the emotions for making a choice about how to handle a situation better, or to learn from it so that I can be better for next time. With leaving the emotions clearly, they're going to come in, but then I need to be aware, and I let them go, and I'm able to stay steady. And it's very helpful in making choices.
Thank you.
Hi, Soror. I think for me, I try to see both sides of the situation, but try to concentrate on the negative side, what would be the side that I wouldn't choose, and see how it could possibly benefit me.
Thank you.
Hello, Grandmaster. Go, Friday.
Okay. So what I find positive about it is that looking at it from the third person perspective allows me to remove myself from preconceived ideas, preconceived notions, any barriers that could be associated with that. And it kind of gives me a clean slate, mind-wise, and it allows me to have a clear retrospection. And it just helps in the whole analysis and analyzing the situation, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Grandmaster.
Hi, Norma.
It's your buddy down in Orlando. Actually, I wrote a story in the memoir that I sent you, and it was very easy for me to write in the third person. And as Cindy mentioned, the emotions are out of the way and there's clarity involved with the situation. So I don't mind third person at times. Thank you.
I think for me, in addition to the great points everyone has raised as far as detaching from the emotional aspect, I think for me, seeing it from a third person also allows me, I think someone mentioned a bit more clarity. and to also look at the situation and to see, you know, what role I may have had in what I was feeling. And it also allows me to see the other person's perspective and perhaps even empathize, you know, with what they were feeling. So maybe they reacted to something that I did or said unknowingly. So it increases the level of empathy and also gives, I suppose, a clearer understanding of the entire situation, not just from my perspective.
Thank you, Maurice. That's nice. Yeah, thank you. Who else was next that would like to speak? Was it?
I'd like to speak
Okay.
because I had a different experience. I had a challenge, and when I thought about a third person seeing it from their point of view, they would have been all upset and emotional and fearful. And I mean, I have had training in my thinking before Rosicrucians, and I handled it by detaching from my thoughts and thinking how to handle it. And it turned out well. And what I learned from that is that don't necessarily listen to what other people say. Use your own intuition also.
Right. Thank you, Ruth. That's nice.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
No, I just think that for me, looking at it from the third person, I feel that I could be more objective and be able to make some more rational decisions in relationship with that person.
Mhm. Excellent. Good point.
It's also a way of looking in the mirror on the outside. This is Michelle, sorry, from Boston. You're looking at yourself on the outside. You're, you know, as looking in the mirror, and it is. You're doing the math yourself in your head. I
had something I wanted to say too. I think for me, looking at it from a third person perspective, it really makes you aware of the space around those thoughts that can actually influence the way you react to those thoughts as subtle pressures or whatever, and that causes a reaction for you to act a certain way. So standing back and looking from the outside, you can see the space that those thoughts occupy. By letting this occupy this much of my space when I'm using it for something else. So it really is effective to do that because it actually helps, I think someone said earlier, clarify the way you think.
Mhm.
The Stoic Epictetus guided us on how we can handle when we're insulted. And he said about these banquets in particular, he said that we should avoid banquets given by non-philosophers, and even then be silent or have few words or change the subject. And the Stoics had many ways of responding to insults or people saying something against them. And I heard some of you share this earlier. First of all, consider if what the person said is possibly true. Is the person well informed? If you respect the person, thank them for their criticism. And if you don't respect the person, then be relieved that they criticized you. And the Stoics used self-deprecating humor, and they also would simply not respond to insults, and they would correct their behavior. The Roman Stoic Cato often wore odd clothing so that he could practice ignoring other people's disdain. So we purposely wore clothes that he thought people would make fun of. And once someone punched Cato, they didn't realize that he was a Roman senator. And when afterwards they were very upset and they asked for his forgiveness, he said that he didn't remember having been struck, although the person had punched him in the face. So it's like it didn't even happen. Epictetus said, remember, it's not enough to be hit or insulted to be harmed. You must believe that you are being harmed. If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. Just pause and take a deep breath. So I've mentioned Epictetus. He was born in the year 50 and he lived to the year 135 of our era. Epictetus was born to a slave, so he was a slave himself. In fact, his name means acquired. That's what Epictetus means, acquired. And his first owner was very cruel to him and permanently injured his leg so that he had to walk with a crutch the rest of his life. And then he was sold to a man who was a freed slave. And this man encouraged Epictetus to study with a very famous Stoic philosopher in Rome, Musonius Rufus, who was so upsetting to the emperors of Rome that he was exiled 3 different times. And he led a very ascetic lifestyle. This was Epictetus's teacher. And he argued that kings should study philosophy. He also said one of the primary objectives of philosophy should be to reveal to us our shortcomings so we can overcome them and thereby live a good life. And Epictetus then was so inspired by Stoicism that he became one of the most important philosophers in ancient Rome, and his master freed him. And then the Emperor Domitian, the Roman emperor, banished all philosophers from Rome. So Epictetus went to Greece, where he lived to be, I think it was 85 years old, and established a very important school of philosophy there. And he never wrote anything down, but his disciple Arrian, who was a historian and a military commander and a philosopher, he took notes from Epictetus's discourses. And this is called the Handbook. And this is still available today. It includes probably the most well-known writing of all the Stoic writings. And the Handbook starts with these words: some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are the body, property, reputation, authority, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. So let's share some things now that are not in our control. What are some things that are not in our control?
Speaks to that. Obviously the coronavirus, the protests, people's opinion of you. Yes, nature, as somebody just recently said. Your wealth, truly your body, even your unconscious mind is not something directly under your control.
Thank you.
Sickness. Being
I've
sick
come-
is not in our control.
I've come to the point where nothing in my life is really in my control, to a point. I believe in fate, and yeah, it's a very strange thing.
The modern Stoics have added a third category. There are things not in our control, and there are things in our control, which is a very small list. And the Stoics the modern Stoics add a third category which is that there are things that are a little bit under our control, but we don't really make the final decision. And an example of this would be that we can prepare for a race, but there's no guarantee that we will win the race. We can train and we can eat right and we can get plenty of rest, but the day of the race, something could happen and we wouldn't necessarily win the race. So what are some examples of things that we have some control, but we don't make the final decision?
Anything subconscious. Anything subconscious. I would have to say that being a mother, I have learned that I can prepare to say, yeah, I'd like to have a baby, but I have no control how it's formed.
I have an example of something that could be in our control partially and partially not in our, or half and half. When I served in the Marine Corps, you know, not just the Marines, but other branches of services, there's deployable units and there's non-deployable units. So if I'm in a non-deployable unit, that's something that I can't control. If they can't deploy, then I can't control that. But I do have the option to apply to a different unit, change a different unit that could deploy. So that's an option. So that's one that comes to my head. So thank you.
Thanks.
Right now, I think I have limited control over the environment. I'm doing what I can, but I can't really control the outcome.
Thank you.
Relationships, in a sense, are things that you can influence, but you do not have control over. And those relationships can relate to people, to the world, and even once again to your unconscious self.
Right. So we can love someone, but we can't guarantee that they will love us.
Exactly.
So knowing this, what can we do? So if we really embrace the fact that even if we love someone with all our heart, it doesn't guarantee that they will love us. Where does that leave us? What can we do?
Yeah, this is Maurice on love. That's a very good point. And you know, I guess I'm getting a little personal on this one. You know, I was deeply in love with someone, and the honesty from her was that she didn't, you know, she liked me a lot, but didn't have that same level of feelings towards me. But that honesty that we both had, you know, increased the respect, and the love actually transformed into her happiness. So even though she couldn't relay those same emotions, I was still very happy for her and wished her well. You know, there's that saying, you know, if you love them, let them go, and if they come back, then I can't quote that, but so I think from my experience, it was actually a positive thing, and it helped me to grow as an individual.
Well, that was communication, which was important, which is what you guys had.
I think acceptance is the key.
I just want to make a comment because the statement there seems to me to be romantic love, but in terms of spirituality, you can love somebody with all your heart. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, I think that's a very good deed. What they want to do in response, that is going to be up to them.
You can only do what's best. You can't necessarily encourage that others will do the same. You can act with justice and virtue and love and charity, but you can't ensure that others will do the same. But that's, again, not something in your control.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing. So some other Stoic practices are that when we have an impression of something, when we think something is real, we can say to the impression, we can speak to this impression that we are having. We can say, an impression is all you are. You are not the source of the impression. So we may be in a situation and not truly see it as it is. And if this is out of my control, then it's none of my concern. So again, Epictetus, he started the handbook is some things are in my control and other things are not. And the things that are in our control are not very many. And most things are not in our control. And if something is out of our control, then the Stoic philosophers say it's really none of our concern. So I invite you to consider, what is something that you have been concerning yourself with that is out of your control and therefore none of your concern? So just think of this for a few minutes. What is something that you have been concerning yourself with that is out of your control and therefore none of your concern?
That is hard because everything is universal. That's a hard question you're asking us, because what's going on in the world right now affects us. It's just like a drop in the ocean and the ripple effects that happen.
Is it within your control?
That we have no control over, but we are to ignore. That's what's going on right now in everybody's life, personally and economically, politically.
So is it possible that there's some aspect that is under control? I don't think any of us are going to get COVID-19 under control, or the many other challenges that we're facing. Is any aspect of that under your control, where it then is your concern?
I can control how I decide to think about it.
What's not in my control, I have been diagnosed with a disease about 10 years ago, multiple myeloma. They tell me I have 10 years to live, but I'm still living. It's not in my control when I'm gonna die because I'm still on treatment. So what should I do about it? You know, it's not in my control.
This is Regina from West Metro Atlanta. And I would say for me, what's not in my control are the mores and values of one person or a particular culture that may differ from the majority of society. I can empathize, I can understand, I can idealize, but I can't change when it's a difference of anyone's choice. I can contend with it or I can ignore it. And that in some way really, I believe, puts me in a Stoic category. But I live with it. I live with it consciously with hopes and inspirations for the highest good of all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Again, we can summarize Stoicism in the 5 words, I don't mind what happens. So we're talking about these very challenging experiences. And from a Stoic perspective, if you want to experience happiness, you have to not mind what happens. However, we often do mind what happens. That's, from a Stoic perspective, that's why we experience pain. It's also very similar to a Buddhist perspective, that it's because we want certain things. And so how do we reconcile this? If we have experiences that are challenging for us, and do we believe that the unhappiness comes from not accepting what is happening?
I think
So
part
I
of that is true, Julie, that sometimes we think we regret what's happened to us. I know, and as you remember, maybe it's almost 7 years now, 7 years in January. I had a massive heart attack from a congenital defect I did not know that I had, and was on the escalator to transition 3 times that day. That was completely out of my control. I had no idea. There were no symptoms, no nothing like that. And then obviously the surgeries later, again, totally out of my control. But how I responded afterwards became important. You work really hard. You want to get well, get back on your feet. There's all these things that you have to try to, these little sign points, posts that you have for yourself as you're trying to recuperate. But at some point you realize, despite all of this, you're not going to be 100% well. Because of what happened to me, I'm never going to be 100% well. And for me at that time, that was a huge thing to have to admit to myself. But it was tremendously liberating at the same time, because it kind of let me do those things that were important to me and cut loose the stuff that was maybe holding me back a little bit. And I've tried to really just try to engage more in the now and with the people around me right now, rather than worry about what's happened or what even might be in the future. Just deal with the now as best as you can. And if you do everything that you feel is right and correct, don't harm anyone in the process, you're going to be okay. That's Stoic, I guess.
I have, Grandmaster Julie, I have found that although I struggle with happiness, I'm more content. And I guess that's sort of a neutral feeling. And I find that when I look back at some of my most troubling struggles, that there were huge lessons. Took a long time to reveal, but there were huge lessons. So I tend to appreciate my struggles more, as I have in the past, knowing that, being optimistic that they are going to lead me to a greater knowledge of self and the world around me.
Thank you.
So before the teleconference started, Grandmaster Julie, I was sharing with some of the fratres and sorors how I'm stuck here in Ukraine. I live in Florida, but I'm here in Ukraine, stuck here due to the COVID-19 quarantine. And I found myself in a crossroads. I can either choose to put all my mental energy to worry about being stuck here, or put my mental energy into good use and see the positive side of it and how I can use this time to grow myself and be of service of others. And so I found that by choosing to not worry on the things that I can't control and actually, you know, think on the positive side, it helps me have a clear mind. It helps me with my memory, like I'm able to remember things better. My mental performance, it's better because I'm not using my mental energy worrying on things that I can't control. So I think there's a lot of positivity that comes from discarding those thoughts of over worrying, over preoccupation. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Another thing is that money won't make you happy. Finding the love of your life, while it's wonderful, won't make you happy. There are people who are completely miserable who have all of those things, who are in great health, who have a great life, you know, with all of the external things. But the thing is that they hate themselves because they're not okay with who they are as people. And that, if you are not a good person, if you can't be okay with who you are, with your own actions, you will never find true happiness. And so Stoicism shows you how to be a good person, how to find the good within yourself, and how to be free of these external desires in that regard.
Thank you. This reminds me of some things that our third Stoic, who we have a lot of writings from still today, Marcus Aurelius, has shared. Marcus Aurelius was not supposed to be, he wasn't in line to be the Roman emperor, but Hadrian, who was the emperor, he asked Antonius to be the emperor with the stipulation that since neither of them had sons, that Marcus Aurelius would be the next emperor. So here is a Stoic philosopher who was deeply inspired by Epictetus, who becomes the Roman emperor. So we have Epictetus, a slave who becomes a philosopher, and Marcus Aurelius. And he kept a personal notebook, a journal, which was published after his death. It's called Meditations, but what he actually called it is to himself. So these are notes that he wrote to himself. And he, just like several of you have said, he focused on the present moment. And he said, stick with the situation at hand and ask, why can't I bear this? You'll be embarrassed to answer. Then remind yourself that the past and the future have no hold on you. And he wrote extensively about what he was grateful for. Now, this man had a lot of challenges in his life. He was born in 121 and went through transition in 180 of our era. And during the time that he was the Roman emperor, Rome was in massive battles all over the empire. Also, there was famine and plague. He had 13 children who he adored, and 8 of them died before him. Commodus was one who survived and connived behind Marcus's back for years. So he had a lot of challenges in his life. And he said the art of living is more like wrestling than dancing. But he always saw it as an opportunity to learn from whatever situation presents itself and to be grateful for that. And he wrote, from my mother, I learned whatever. From my father, I learned whatever. And I invite you now to consider for a moment some people who have had a great effect on your life, even if it isn't positive, and say, from my father, I learned, and then just make a note. From my father, what did you learn from your father? Even if it was just not to do something. From your mother, what's something that you learned from your mother? Again, it can be positive, or it can be something that you don't want to do.
I learned from my father to value happiness over anything else.
I learned a great deal from my father But the most important thing that I learned from my father actually came on his deathbed. You know, he was at a point in and out of consciousness, of being conscious of what he was doing. But one of the last things he said to me, and we had a wonderful relationship, I mean, but I took this last thing and it has guided my life exclusively, really. He said, all there is love. And that was so powerful for me because, you know, especially as a Rosicrucian, and he was a Rosicrucian too, but all the teachings really kind of were summed up by that. And I imagine that has something to do with Stoicism too. But yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Would anyone else like to share?
Julie,
Hello? Hello?
I really think that, I really haven't shared this to many people. My father and I were estranged for many, many, many years. And he had moved out of state, had remarried and so on. And then probably 8 years ago now, I got a phone call from his wife saying that he was in the hospital, critical condition. He wasn't expected to last the week. And I should probably make plans to come and see him. I struggled mightily with that because we never had that kind of a relationship. And it got to be, you know, at times physically abusive from him during that time too. So it was very, very difficult. And I had that little voice, call it the voice of the cosmic or whatever, whisper in my head said, if you're to be the person you're supposed to be, you need to do this. And I got on a plane and I flew there. He hadn't recognized anybody in weeks. When I walked into the ICU, his eyes got really big. And his wife was standing there and said, David, do you recognize this? In a very clear voice, he said, of course I know who this is. This is my son, Jeff. He's an artiste. And he had never acknowledged that part of my life or anything to that point at all. So I think from my father, I learned forgiveness. It's the best way that I can put it. Very close and personal to me. So thank you for letting me share it.
Thank you for sharing that.
I learned something from my father. He was verbally abusive and rejecting all my young life. And as I grew up in my mature years, I started to look at the whole thing differently. And I found out that he had been treated that way himself. And he had been verbally abused and so on and so forth, and didn't get his life wishes. And I learned compassion from that. And it's been a wonderful lesson.
Oh, thank you so much. Now we're going to do our final meditation. And this is based on an experience of a man named Julius Canus. And Julius Canus was a Stoic philosopher, and the tyrant Caligula condemned him to death for no reason other than the fact that he was a philosopher. And when the emperor announced his order, Canus replied, "Thank you, excellent prince." And then there was a requirement that when someone was condemned to death, they had to wait 10 days. And during that period, or after that period, a soldier came to get Canus for the execution. And he was playing a board game with a friend at the time. And instead of begging or running, he simply pointed out to the soldier that in this game he was playing, he was one move ahead of the person he was playing against. And he went with the executioner. And when the execution was about to take place, one of his friends asked Canus what he was thinking about. And he said that he was preparing himself to observe whether at the moment of death, the soul is aware of leaving the body. That is what this Stoic philosopher was focusing on when the time of his transition was at hand. And that's how I want to approach my great initiation, with that kind of presence of mind and just presence, period. To just wonder, when this happens, am I going to notice the moment when the soul leaves the body? So I invite you now to consider how you want to face your transition. When that time comes, how do you want to behave? Close your eyes and see yourself in your final moments, living out the values you have chosen to embrace. Acting in harmony with who you believe you are, with the character that you have embraced for yourself. See yourself in your final moments. So mote it be. So fratres and sorors, thank you so much for participating in this discussion today. We're going to post in the chat some suggested reading if you're interested in knowing more about Stoicism. There are a number of resources that are available. Also, the presentation on Rosicrucianism and Stoicism that I presented at the AMORC World Convention in Rome is available on youtube.com/RosicrucianTV, so you can watch that there. And we published a Rosicrucian digest that was dedicated to mystical Italy. And in that digest is an article that I wrote on Rosicrucianism and Stoicism, and it includes these references. So if you're not able to get them from the chat, don't worry about it. Just go to the Rosicrucian Digest online and choose the issue Mystical Italy. I think it was #1 from 2019. And then at the end of that article, it shows the references. And we're also going to post in the chat some music that you may find interesting and related to Stoicism. And there's one piece of music that I found very interesting. It's by an artist named Akira the Don, A-K-I-R-A, Akira the Don, and Marcus Aurelius. And he does hip hop and rap to Marcus Aurelius's meditations. And I just love that this is done. Hip hop and rap are not my favorite type of music. And often I'll see people on the street and they're really getting into their rap, and I'm like, wow, do they know that they are planting those words that they're saying in their brains? And I love that Marcus Aurelius's meditations are in this hip hop. So to conclude, I'm going to play just a tiny part of that we can listen to. These are meditations from the book, which was Marcus Aurelius's personal diary. And this is called Grateful to the Deities, or Grateful to the Gods. And we'll just, let's see, I'm gonna share. And we'll listen to just part of this. But I just love the fact that people can be going around listening to this rap and hip hop, being inspired by the words and wisdom of Marcus Aurelius. So here we go, Grateful to the Gods.
when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. Not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. Not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. So none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate it. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the two rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. Yo, discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your...
So again, this rapper is Akira the Don, A-K-I-R-A. And I have to say it's very catchy. And I just love that people are hearing these meditations in this way. So thank you all so much for your participation today. As always, it's wonderful to see you. And we will unmute. So if you'd like to say anything as we sign off, just click on the unmute button for yourself. And next week, we're going to be exploring Radiant Health, a Refresher. So I will be on the call next week, which, believe it or not, that is July 1st already. And we're going to be reviewing some Rosicrucian healing techniques. So
Wonderful.
profound, everyone.